Hello, everyone. I do have a couple of minutes past 9:30, and so I think it's safe to get started. We are broadcasting the audio portion over the internet, so you should be able to hear us without having to dial in. But if you are experiencing some difficulties, we do have some dial-in instructions just as backup. So you'll see those on your screen right now. And you might want to take note if you're having some difficulties. So the line is muted for the entire call. So to ask a question, you do need to use the Q&A feature on your screen. So with that, we'll get right into our webinar today. So what we'll be covering is a framework for mentoring CASB students through the spring session in 2012, and the modules that are currently in session right now are modules 1, 2, 3, and 5. So my name is Laura Gregorick, and I'm CASB's Director of CA Training Offices, and I'll be leading you through the material today for the first portion of the webinar. And then Sakina Rashid, who's CASB's Director of Learning Center Operations, will be joining us at the end of the session to take your questions. So we have a full hour together today, but we only have about 25 to 30 minutes of formal material to cover. So we will have plenty of time to address your questions, and if you don't have a lot of questions, we'll finish a little bit early today. So again, as a reminder, you can submit your questions throughout the session by using that Q&A menu. And as I just mentioned, Sakina will join us at the end of the session, and we'll take your questions then. And I also wanted to mention that we have uploaded today's slides as well into live meeting. So you can download a copy of those by clicking on the handouts icon, and that's in the top right-hand corner of your screen. It's the icon that looks like 3 little sheets of paper. So that's where the slides are available for download. Okay, so we'll get into our learning objectives for today. So by the end of the session, you will know what's new in the CASB program for spring 2012. You'll also be able to identify student challenges that are common across all the modules. You'll be familiar with common mentoring practices at both smaller and larger offices. And you'll also be able to understand what you as mentors can do to support your students. You'll know what resources are available to assist you. And you'll know how to access the CASB Mentor Center, which is new, and you'll also know how to register for the mentor modules. So we'll start by highlighting some recent changes that we've made here at CASB. So since our last round of mentor webinars, we have made a number of changes. We've switched from Blackboard to Desire to Learn, which is the learning management system that we use to deliver all of our modules. So Desire to Learn's functionality is pretty much comparable to Blackboard's, and we've tried to retain kind of the existing module layout. So students' online experience shouldn't really be significantly impacted, as it'll be pretty similar to what they were used to seeing in the previous system. And we've also compared a number of comprehensive guides and some shorter quick start guides to provide students with further assistance with this change. And we've reduced the number of weekly submissions to 7 in each module. So that leaves week 8 for students to prepare for their module end evaluations. So they'll have time in week 8 to write practice cases and ask facilitators questions and that type of thing without having to complete additional tasks. So this change should alleviate some of the stress that students experience when they're preparing for that module end evaluation. And then starting this month, the Sunday of the face-to-face sessions in all 5 modules are going to be ending at 1:30 p.m. instead of 2:30 p.m. And we've made this change pretty much in response to feedback from students and facilitators. And so we've accomplished this by streamlining the content that we deliver on Sundays and also reducing the lunch break. It used to be 45 minutes, and now it's going to be 20 minutes. So the start time for each day still is at 8:30 a.m., and then the Friday and the Saturday portions of the face-to-face session remain unchanged, so they still finish at 4 p.m. as before. And we've also changed our approach to how we support mentors, and so that's what we're going to be talking about today as well. So, in our previous approach to supporting your mentoring activities, we would hold webinars for each specific module. And what we found was that the content for these module-specific sessions tended to be quite repetitive because students were pretty much struggling with the same types of challenges throughout all the modules. So based on your feedback from these previous sessions, we've developed a common mentoring framework that should be able to help you support your students through modules 1 to 5. And we've also identified how the framework can differ for smaller offices and larger offices. And something else that's new is the Mentor Center, and we'll talk more about that. So it's a self-serve mentor center on the CASB website, and you can access some additional mentoring resources in the Mentor Center. So it includes things like a number of different administrative resources and guides. We've also got some mentoring guidance on specific topics like case writing and critical thinking, that type of thing, as well as a section for module-specific mentoring resources. And we'll cover the Mentor Center in greater detail throughout today's session. So in the next section, we'll identify some student challenges that are common to all the modules. And again, if you're looking for module-specific challenges, you can refer to the modules 1 through 5 mentoring tips presentations, and those are in the Mentor Center. So before we talk about specific student struggles, I think we should take a moment to understand the level of progression that's built in across all 5 CASB modules. So as students are progressing from modules 1 to 5, the CASB curriculum does include more integrative content. And what we mean by that is that students need to consider all the implications of issues and how those issues are interrelated. And they also need to use multiple resources when they're developing solutions. And students are also faced with more complex tasks, and we provide them with less direction. So then their responses do require technical knowledge, but they also require professional judgment because there is complexity and ambiguity involved as you progress. And each module also places some higher expectations on students' communication and critical thinking skills. So, students do need to be tailoring their responses to the specific audience, and they also thoroughly need to research and analyze and support their analysis and make sure that they're offering a recommendation that's useful to their particular users. So as students are developing competencies in each of the modules, our expectations of them are progressively increasing. So that's why we tend to see some common areas of weakness across all the modules. So it's not that students aren't developing as they progress through the modules. It's simply that we also expect more of them as they progress. So the 5 most common areas where we do see students struggling across all 5 CASB modules would be the communication and critical thinking skills, case writing skills, research skills, some various technical skills, and as well as the ability to manage their time effectively. So when it comes to communication skills, we often see students struggling with proper formatting. So they might not use headings and bullet points effectively, or they don't format their spreadsheets appropriately. And another common issue we see is the use of an overly critical tone, and this is particularly common when they're reviewing the work of others in their tasks. And sometimes this can come off more as arrogance rather than as confidence, and so that's obviously not a good thing in a professional setting. And sometimes students do fail to consider the user's sophistication level, and they might use some language or provide a little bit more detail than is appropriate for their particular audience. So the next couple deal with critical thinking skills, and when it comes to critical thinking skills, we do see a couple of issues. So the first one is bias. So students might come to a conclusion prematurely, and their conclusion is generally supported by evidence, but the response wouldn't be thorough in that they're ignoring some contradictory information. So they're basically ignoring the inconvenient facts that don't support their conclusion, and this leads to bias. And then on the flip side, the other thing that we might see is where students provide a really thorough analysis, and it's probably excessively long, and what they're doing here is failing to prioritize the most important issues, and as a result, they're failing to provide a recommendation to users, so there's no conclusion. So again, case writing is also another area where we see students struggling across all 5 modules. And when it comes to case writing, what we often see is issues with, or problems with issue identification. So a student might miss some important issues that are critical to the case. And some students might identify a critical issue, but they might only discuss it superficially. So as a result, their response would lack depth. And some students might not provide, or might provide some generic excerpts from technical resources in their responses, rather than integrating the specific facts from the case that they're considering. And some students might not consider the user's needs, and they may provide some information that is irrelevant to the specific users that in the given case. And then some students might neglect to explain their calculations, and so it's really important that every quantitative analysis that students perform needs to be accompanied with a corresponding qualitative component. And then finally, some students might provide a thorough analysis, but they might not provide a conclusion. And so every case, again, must include recommendations that would address specific user needs. And so, at this point, you might be thinking that some of the challenges look a bit similar to the ones we identified on the previous slide, and that's because communication and critical thinking skills are related to case writing. So students whose skills are well developed in these areas will be more proficient at case writing. So CASB does encourage students to be self-directed learners, and we don't explicitly tell students where to find information, and that's because we do expect them to research it themselves, and some students don't do well with this lack of direction. So this is another area that we see a common struggle across all 5 modules. And then students will encounter some technical challenges as they make their way through the CASB program. And so it's really difficult to generalize the technical areas that students could struggle with. We do cover a wide variety of technical topics across all 5 modules, and students can pretty much struggle in any of these areas. So for you as mentors, really the best way to identify where your students are struggling is to have that discussion with them on their technical challenges. And then finally, throughout the CASB program, we do see students struggling with being able to manage their time wisely. And so the CASB program is challenging, and students' professional workloads are also substantial. So a lot of students do find that managing the CASB program along with the workplace demands concurrently is quite overwhelming. And then achieving competency also may require revisions. So some students don't clear their revisions promptly, or they might underestimate the amount of time it takes to clear revisions, and this results in a time crunch for them. And then some students also tend to employ a cram mentality when it comes to preparing for the module end evaluations. And so really what we recommend is that students recognize that every task that they have completed throughout the prior 8 weeks has steadily been preparing them for this evaluation. So there really isn't a need to cram at the last minute. So those are the common struggles. So now I'll provide you with an overview of some common mentoring practices at training offices, and then differentiate between those that work best in smaller offices and those that would be more appropriate for larger offices. So offices with fewer students and fewer staff members to support them may not have the resources to kind of implement some of these really complex or comprehensive mentoring programs. So many smaller offices would typically select 2 or 3 basic mentoring activities to focus on. And what we tend to see is 3 things. So one would be a buddy system. And this really provides students with some focused one-on-one support. Another common one we see are practice case writing sessions, and this provides students with some opportunities to hone their case writing skills, and it also provides them with some directed feedback on the cases that they've written. And then the final one would be time off for study, and this isn't a CASB mandated practice, but it is something that tends to happen at CA training offices. So in addition to the 3 practices we just covered, the larger offices have more students and more staff to support them, so they tend to implement a number of additional mentoring activities. And so some of these might include an orientation session at kind of the beginning of the CASB program, and this provides students with an overview of the program and outlines what students can expect over the next couple of years. Some offices also choose to hold a Module 1 session, and this provides some support and guidance in areas where students are typically struggling, especially when they're new to the CASB program. And some offices also choose to hold case writing sessions, and these provide some additional support to students that are writing comprehensive cases and integrated multi-subject questions for the first time. So it's really more about strategy for case writing. Then again, other offices hold various technical sessions, really geared towards providing some additional instructions in the specific technical areas that their students are finding challenging. And other offices choose to appoint module champions, and so these would be people who are the go-to people for any module-specific questions for students. So they're almost like subject matter experts on a particular module. And then the other 2 are pretty much kind of administrative. So the administrative support for the CASB's mentoring program, and then a formalized CASB mentoring team that provides overall leadership for the office's mentoring activities. So you can watch the CA Training Office Mentoring Practices presentation, and that's in the Mentor Center, and it gives a little bit more information about each of these common mentoring practices. And I just wanted to note that none of these practices are required, so we certainly don't, mandate that you do these, but we do encourage you to select any that are of interest to you and would be appropriate in your environment. So next, we'll suggest a general framework that you can use to support your CASB students during the first 5 modules. And this framework is applicable to Module 4 as well, but since Module 4 is not in session right now, we didn't specifically mention it in the presentation. So we're focusing on Mods 1, 2, 3, and 5. And then for module-specific mentoring tips, you can refer to the Modules 1 through 5 mentoring tips presentations, and those can be found in the Mentor Center. So in the previous section, we just covered some common mentoring practices at training offices. So in this section, we're going to concentrate on those that work best in all training offices, regardless of size. And we mentioned earlier, in week 7 of all the modules, the tasks end. So we're not assigning additional tasks to students in week 8. So what that means is that students can use that time in week 8 to prepare for their module end evaluations, which take place in the 9th week. So since students now have more time to prep in week 8, time off for study becomes less of an issue. And since this is not a CASB-mandated practice anyway, we're not going to concentrate on this particular practice either. So each module is 8 weeks long, with the evaluation taking place in week 9, and then results are released subsequently. And after results are released, students do have a brief period where they can appeal their results. So the Module 1 face-to-face session takes place earlier in the 8-week module. And then the face-to-face sessions for Module 3 and Module 5 take place roughly around the middle of the modules. And the Module 2 face-to-face session takes place more towards the end of the module. And if you're looking for specific dates as to when these take place and the key events, you can look at the schedule of key dates, and that's available in the Mentor Center. So from a mentoring perspective, we'll focus on the buddy system and practice case writing sessions, which we just mentioned in the previous slide. So as buddies, we do recommend that mentors check in with their students about 3 to 4 times per module. And so the first check-in would be at the beginning of the module, and this would identify any particular concerns that the student might have at that point. And then we recommend that you check in once after the face-to-face session, and this would be to identify any technical challenges that students are experiencing at that point. And then once at the midpoint of the module, just to see how things are going, and also to discuss communication and critical thinking feedback. And then the fourth check-in would be once at the end of week 7, and this would be to discuss the plan for preparing for the module and evaluation. So some of these check-ins can be combined, so that's why we say you can meet 3 to 4 times. So for example, when you look at the module 3 and 5 face-to-face sessions, they generally tend to fall towards the midpoint of the module. So you could combine that with the midpoint check-in, so you're meeting with your students 3 times rather than 4 times. And then in week 8, you'd want to encourage students to write practice cases. So in larger offices, this would be done in informal group settings. And then in smaller offices, students can write practice cases on their own, and a mentor could provide feedback on the case. And so then finally, any additional mentoring practices that we discussed, so for example, technical sessions or sessions that work on specific skills like case writing, can take place at any point throughout the modules. So that's the overall framework that we're proposing. So next we'll cover what happens at each check-in and how you can address some of the common student challenges at these check-ins. So at the first check-in, you'll want to ensure that you and your students become familiar with module content and anticipate any challenges. So the things you can do at the first check-in would be reviewing the student overview and also the practical application checklist for that specific module. And since time management is also an area that students struggle with, you might want to refer your students to some work-life balance resources or other tools that will help them manage their time effectively and basically have them avoid becoming overwhelmed. And so then after reviewing the student overview together, you may want to ask your students what challenges they anticipate encountering. Similarly, after reviewing the practical application checklist, you may also want to consider how you can reinforce your students' learning in the workplace. And then you also want to have a discussion about effective time management. So in terms of resources, we have the student overviews for all modules, and these would be useful to review with the student during the first check-in. And you can find these overviews in the Mentor Center. And then, as I mentioned, we have the practical application checklists as well. So these basically take the same information from the module storyboards, and they present them in a format that's aligned to kind of workplace departments. So they give you a checklist of what students should be able to do in the workplace after completing each module. And so this would also be a useful tool to review during your first check-in, and the practical application checklists are also available in the Mentor Center. So the work-life balance section of the CICA's website does contain a number of resources and tools that talk about maintaining balance and avoiding becoming overwhelmed. So CASB students might find this useful. And we have also solicited some advice from current and past CASB students on how to survive the grind of kind of working at CA training offices and having a pretty demanding workload while concurrently completing the CASB program. So we'll have a related mentoring resource that will come out of that feedback that we solicited from students. It will be available in the Mentor Center in early summer. And then finally, your office might also have some internal resources or employee assistant programs or those types of things that could also be useful if your students are really struggling. So at the second check-in, you'll want to see how the face-to-face session went, and you'll also want to identify any technical or research challenges that your students are encountering so far. So at this check-in, you may want to review the face-to-face material together with the student, and also review the useful resources and readings list, and that's in the student overview together with the student, and any information in the Technical Resource Center for that particular module as well. And your office might also have some internal resources that can assist you in coaching your students through some of their technical weaknesses. And so this could be things like any technical guides that you have internally, or there might be some internal subject matter experts as well that are particularly good in a specific field. And then as another way to kind of focus on the technical side of things, you can also encourage your students to complete the weekly multiple choice questions because these do serve as good technical review, and encouraging them to participate in the weekly chats as well. And so since this check-in occurs after the face-to-face sessions, you'll want to ask your student how it went. You may also want to ask your student to identify any technical or research challenges encountered so far, so that the two of you together can figure out how best to support your students through these challenges. And then when it comes to resources to help at the second check-in, so each module does have a week-by-week list of useful resources and readings. So students can use this list for reference when they're performing research to complete their weekly tasks. And the resources will also help them overcome some of those technical challenges that they're encountering. So these lists are in the module student overviews for each module, and they're also available in the Mentor Center. And so additionally, I mentioned the Technical Resource Center. So again, you can refer your students to this area of the modules. The center would contain a number of different CASB guides. There's some specific technical guides that are arranged by competency area. And we also link out to some relevant external information that would be useful in completing tasks and identifying, resources for research and overcoming some of those technical struggles. So for mentors, you can access these in the CASB mentor modules. And then I mentioned the weekly multiple choice questions, or MCQs. So each week of every module does contain these optional multiple choice questions that students can complete, and they're an excellent technical review tool because students do receive instant feedback on their performance as they complete each question. So you can find those MCQs in the CASB mentor modules as well for each module. And so finally, for check-in number 2, if students are struggling with identifying some resources or working through some of the technical topics, you can also encourage them to attend the weekly chat sessions. So in these sessions, the facilitators do identify some good technical resources to take a look at, and they also provide some general tips on approach for weekly tasks. So the sessions aren't mandatory, but what we've found is that students who do attend the chat sessions do tend to perform better in their tasks. So it is a good idea to encourage students to participate. And so then we'll move on to check-in number 3. And at the third check-in, you'll want to understand how things are going so far, since the student is now at the midpoint of the module. And you'll also want to encourage the development of communication and critical thinking skills. So students do receive feedback, and it comes in the form of numerical ratings and written feedback on these skills at certain points in each module. So together with your students, you can review their communication and critical thinking ratings and feedback. And you can also review the communication and critical thinking guide to get a better understanding of what the ratings and feedback mean and how students can specifically improve these skills. And you may also want to review the critical thinking mentor tool. And this tool provides some specific guidance on how you can assist your students in progressing through these skills. And then you can also offer at this point to review some general facilitator feedback that the student has received on their weekly tasks to date. So for this check-in, the guidance questions would include, how are things going? Do you have any concerns? How do you feel about the ratings and feedback you've received on your communication and critical thinking skills? And what are your thoughts on other feedback received from your facilitator so far? So again, it's pretty much a general check-in, focusing more on communication and critical thinking skills. So in terms of resources, We do suggest that you and your students familiarize yourselves with the Communication and Critical Thinking Guide, because this guide would be providing substantial guidance on how students can improve these skills. And you can find this guide in the Mentor Center. So earlier we mentioned that students do tend to struggle with formatting. So if that's an area that's a struggle for your students, you can encourage them to use the formatting checklist, and this is provided in the Communication and Critical Thinking Guide, and that's in Appendix C. And I also wanted to note that the various CASB guides, so kind of the more technical stuff, they do provide examples of how to format quantitative analyses. So you can refer your students to the examples in the guides as well. So I've included a few examples of guides here, but all of them are available in the Technical Resource Center in each module. And as a mentor, you'd be able to find them in the CASB mentor modules. And again, tone was another area where students struggle. So to ensure that they're using appropriate tone, you can refer your students to Appendix D of the Communication and Critical Thinking Guide. And that appendix contains a checklist and some further guidance on professional tone. And then audience was another area where students had difficulty. So to ensure that your students are considering the user's sophistication level and are also using language that's appropriate for their users or providing a level of detail that's appropriate for their specific audience, you can refer your students to Appendix E of the Communication and Critical Thinking Guide. And this contains a checklist and also further guidance. And again, it's available in the Mentor Center. And we do have two tools available that would help your students with critical thinking skills. So Appendix F of the Communication and Critical Thinking Guide contains a checklist and some further guidance on critical thinking. And then we have a critical thinking mentor tool, and that also offers some further suggestions. And this tool focuses more on how you can coach your students to strengthen their critical thinking skills. And so you can find both of these tools in the Mentor Center. So that covers check-in number 3. So then we move on to check-in number 4. And the fourth check-in would take place once the tasks have ended in week 7. So at this check-in, you'll want to identify how students are going to prepare for that module end evaluation that's just around the corner, and also what they need from you in order to do so. So at this point, you can encourage your students to develop a plan of attack, and you can jointly and explicitly, I would say, lay out what you will do to support them. So student activities will likely include some form of technical review, and you can refer them to any of the materials that we've pointed out so far earlier in the session for guidance on technical. And students will also include some, I guess, practice case writing as well to prepare for that module and evaluation. And we'll talk more about that in the next section. So for this check-in, the guiding questions would include how will you prepare for the module and evaluation, and how can I be of assistance? So we'll move on to practice case writing. So we would recommend that you hold practice case writing sessions, and they do look a little bit different at a larger office versus a smaller office. But the purpose of these sessions would be to provide students with some additional opportunities to practice their case writing skills, and also to provide them with some feedback on the cases that they've written. So at a larger office, students could write practice cases in exam-like conditions in a group setting. And at smaller offices, it would happen individually. So then a mentor would evaluate the response and provide feedback. Larger offices sometimes hire somebody external to perform this kind of marking and evaluation function. And then cases are debriefed in group settings, usually in larger offices, and it would be individually in smaller offices. And then the feedback received on that practice case that they do receive that's evaluated by the mentor, that feedback would dictate the direction of self-study that students would take in week 8. So you'll want to evaluate and provide feedback on the practice case as soon as the tasks end in week 7. So this would still allow a lot of time for students to write additional practice cases on their own throughout week 8. And we have a number of resources that are available to assist you and your students with the practice case writing process. So we'll cover each of those in the following slides. So to assist your students just with the development of an approach to case writing, you can refer to the Approaching a Simulation Guide. And that guide is available in the CASB Mentor modules. And we also have an Approaching a Simulation presentation in the Mentor Center, and that offers specific guidance on case writing as well. So you might want to refer to that. And then in the last few pages of the Approaching a Simulation Guide, we do provide students with an example of how to outline a simulation. So this is something that's quite useful for them as they're developing these skills. And again, you can find this guide in the CASB Mentor modules. So we do have a practice case introduction for every module as well. And this introduction provides students with some further guidance on how to approach and debrief simulations. And you can find that document in the CASB Mentor modules. And additionally, debriefing is very, I could say, a very important part of the learning process. So it's not enough to just write cases. You do have to debrief them to kind of solidify that learning. And in Module 5, we have a specific debriefing guide that would assist students as they're approaching UFI simulations for the first time, because case writing in Module 5 becomes particularly important because the UFI is just around the corner. So again, both of these resources are available in the Mentor modules. And then each module contains a number of practice cases. So there's case studies, and the case studies would include a case assessment that you can use for evaluation purposes, and also a sample response. So you and your students would use these resources when you're doing the practice case writing sessions. So that would include writing, evaluating, and debriefing practice cases. And you can find all of these resources in each of the CASB Mentor modules as well. And students do use laptops to input their responses to module evaluations and also for the UFI. And they are required to use a software called Secure Exam. And this is pretty much a lockdown software program, so it would disable most of a computer's functionality and files while the students are writing evaluations. So as mentors, you can encourage students to use Secure Exam when they're writing their practice cases so that they become familiar with this software. We do have a number of Secure Exam guides that you can refer to, and these are available in the Mentor Center as well. And we have an additional guide that offers some Secure Exam tips specifically for case writing, and this guide is available in the CASB Mentor modules. So then we'll move on to kind of the remaining practices. So any size office can choose to employ the remaining practices, but larger offices are just a little more likely to implement them because they do require a bit, I guess, a greater level of effort and resources. So these practices can be held at any point during the modules, but I would say that the orientation session, the Module 1 session, and case writing skills session would probably be most effective near the beginning of Module 1 when students are really new to the entire CASB program. And the case writing skills session can also be held as a refresher at any point during the CASB program. And I did mention in Module 5, case writing becomes particularly important because the UFI is just around the corner. So as a reminder, you can watch the CA Training Office Mentoring Practices presentation in the Mentor Center for additional information about each of these practices. So today's session offered a general mentoring framework that you can apply across all the modules to assist your students with some of those challenges that we tend to see across all the modules. So if you're looking for some module-specific mentoring tips and some related resources, you can refer to the Mentor Center because we do have a module-specific section for each of modules 1 through 5. So at this point, what we'll do is identify the resources that are available to assist you when you're supporting your students, and also point out how to access the CASB Mentor Center. So you do have, you've heard me refer to at least 2 sources of information throughout today's session. There are actually 3 sources of information that are available to you as mentors. So we have what we're calling the Mentor Center, we have the CASB Mentor modules, and we have the UP Prep Mentor module. So I'll take a moment to distinguish between each of these 3. So the Mentor Center contains a number of mentoring resources. So this would include an overview of the common mentoring practices of training offices, which is today's session. It would include a general framework for mentoring students through modules 1 to 5, again, today's session. Module-specific mentoring tips, and also some additional mentoring guidance on some specific topics, so things like case writing and critical thinking, and we did mention the Surviving the Grind mentoring resource that's coming in the early summer. We would be also posting the recordings of any webinars that we hold to the Mentor Center as well. So the Mentor Center is located on the CASB website, and it is open to all. You don't need to register to get access to it, and this is because we are supporting the mentoring activities that you carry out at training offices. And then we have the mentor modules. So we have 2 different types of mentor modules. We have the CASB mentor modules, and these contain all the learning materials for modules 1 through 5. So it would be the same materials that your students are engaging with as they're completing the CASB modules. And the CASB Mentor modules also contain links to the relevant resources that are in the Mentor Center. So we do cross-reference those 2. The CASB Mentor modules are housed in Desire to Learn, and that's our learning management system. And since they do contain proprietary learning materials, you do have to register to gain access to these modules. And then finally, we have the UP Prep Mentor module. And this would contain all the learning materials from CASB's UP Prep program, and it would also have links to relevant Mentor Center resources for cross-referencing purposes. The UP Prep Mentor module would provide you with access to, again, those same learning materials that your students are using to prepare for the UP. It's also housed in Desire to Learn. And again, because it does contain some proprietary learning materials, you do have to register to obtain access. So all of the resources that we highlighted today are either in the Mentor Center or the CASB Mentor modules. So finally, we'll show you how to register for the Mentor modules. And so again, as I just mentioned in the previous slides, so the Mentor modules do differ from the Mentor Center in that they would contain all the learning materials for modules 1 through 5. And registration would allow you to see those same materials that your students are seeing as they're completing the CASB modules. And registration also enables you to get advance notice of any mentoring events that we're holding, such as this webinar. And you'd be informed of any new mentoring resources that we're developing. To register, you do need to be either a qualified CA or a CASB student that's more senior to the student that you'd be mentoring. And HR and student contacts at CA training offices can also register even if they're not CAs, because these folks tend to be heavily involved in mentoring programs at training offices as well. So to register, you simply complete the CASB Mentor registration application, and that can be found in the form section of the CASB website. Registration is valid until about mid-October of each year, and we do refresh the content with each module offering. And then we contact you every fall to renew your registration for the coming year. So you don't have to complete forms each year, but you do have to respond to our request for renewal annually. And even though we didn't specifically cover UP Prep mentoring today, some of you may also mentor students who are preparing for the UP, so I just wanted to take a moment to point out how you can get access to the UP Prep Mentor module. So again, as a reminder, it does differ from the Mentor Center because it contains the UFI Prep learning materials that your students would be engaging with as they prepare for the UFI over the summer. And if you register, you get access to that same material, and you also get advance notice of any UFI mentoring events that we hold, such as webinars. And you're also informed of any when new resources are developed. And similar to the previous slide, qualified CAs can register. However, CASB students can register, but they just have to have successfully completed the UFI to be able to register. And then again, HR and student contacts can also register even if they're not CAs. And then this registration application is also found in the forms section of the CASB website. Here, registration is valid till the end of April of each year, and we do refresh the content each May when we kick off kind of our UFI prep activities. And we contact registered mentors each spring to renew their registration for the coming year. So that does conclude the formal part of the presentation, and at this point, we'll take your questions. And I'll be reading the questions and kind of being the moderator. And at this point, Sukaina Rashid, the director of CASB's Learning Center Operations, will respond to them. And so as a reminder, you can submit your questions using the Q&A menu on your screen. And I just wanted to also take a moment to remind you that you can download a copy of today's presentation by clicking that handouts icon in the top right-hand section of your screen. It's the one that looks like 3 sheets of paper. So I'll just pause here for a moment and see what kind of questions would come in. And Sukaina, are you with us?
I am. Hi, Lara.
Welcome. Okay, good. So let's see what we have. Oh, whoops. Okay, so the first one I think is a relatively easy one, but we'll pass it over to Sukaina. So the question is, does module end evaluation mean examination?
We don't really call it examination just because it's meant to sort of see if the students demonstrate competency, so it's not your traditional examination, but I guess, yeah, like in some ways you could call it that. So it is the exam that they write at the end of the module.
Okay. Thank you, Sukaina. So the next question we've received is, okay, are these changes in effect for the current modules now underway, i.e., no assigned tasks in week 8? So Sukaina, I'll give the floor to you.
Yeah, we went through a rework of all of the modules, and we streamlined the content. We removed some tasks that are repetitive. I don't know if some of you might have gone through the CASB program, and you might know we had tasks like, business number and researching and things like that. So the tasks that were those, like dumping tasks, we sort of removed them and provided the information to the students, and that's how we were able to streamline. And yeah, those changes are in effect for the May 2012 modules.
Great. And Sukaina, and that's going forward, it will remain that way, yes?
It will, yes.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so the next question we have is, for multi-style practice cases, do you recommend that students write the cases back-to-back or one at a time, followed by an immediate debrief? Sukaina.
I would recommend that they write them back-to-back just because that is what they do at the evaluation. It's a 4-hour sit-down, so they would do multiple cases within the 4-hour period. So it would be best if they simulate that.
Okay, thank you. And the next question is, we are a small firm who deals specifically with ASB, no IFRS. Will that be a problem for our students going forward? That's a great question. Sukaina.
We do hope that our content does cover IFRS. We've got guides on the different topic areas in IFRS that are more complex, like hedging and consolidations and financial instruments. So we're hoping that the students, when they look at these guides, they will become familiar with this material. Obviously, the students that don't practice this material are at a disadvantage, but we have the opposite. So students in a bigger firm might be exposed to IFRS, but not ASB. So I think it kind of just depends.
Great. Thank you very much. So I will pause. We don't see any additional questions at this point. I'll just take a couple extra seconds. And if you do think of a question after the fact, I think everybody has my email address, and you can feel free to send it along to me on a one-on-one basis, and we'll make sure that we get you a response. Okay, I'm not seeing any additional questions coming in at this point, so I will say thank you very much for joining us today. I hope you found the session useful, and we're certainly very appreciative of what mentors do, and we support your activities in supporting your students. So a recording of today's session will be posted to the Mentor Center by the end of the week. So you can look for it there and pass it on to those who were not able to attend today in your office. So this does conclude today's session. Thank you again for attending.
The